To some degree, everyone who plays fantasy football does player rankings. For some, hundreds of hours of research. Others, just putting names in a desired order, it works for them. Regardless, every year there's a small number of players who the fantasy community does not have a firm grasp of their value. Today, we'll talk about 6 players who are difficult to project in 2024 fantasy football leagues. Welcome to the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Circa Sports, where you can compete for $16 million in total prizes by playing in the Circa Million 6 and the Circa Survivor Contest. I'm Jim Coventry, joined by Anthony Cervino. Remember to follow Anthony at The Real NFL Guru, and you can find me over at Jim Coventry NFL. Today's show will include myself and Anthony talking about players that have been very difficult to project in the fantasy community. Anthony, this happens every year. These players that we're going to talk about today, we did a show on July 15th. So if you missed the first 7 hard to predict players, you definitely could look back on the podcast feed for that one as well. But these players, if you ask avid hardcore fantasy players about these players, they'll have a take on them, but it's never a strong take. And people just seem to put them in these general draft slots. And I think anybody that's going all in or all out on these players, they're probably missing something. So let's start with T. Higgins, Anthony. T. Higgins is one of the most impossible players to predict. First of all, he's missed some time, but he has not had an 1,100-yard season. He has not had more than 7 yards in a season. Yet when we watch him play, we see times he's a superstar. He's not had more than 110 targets in a season. Now, all that said, the biggest issue in my mind, there's 2. One's been injuries, though. Higgins doesn't miss a lot of games. He missed 3 last year. He missed 1 in 22. He missed 5 last year. He missed 1 in 2022, and he missed 3 games as a rookie. So that is substantial. But he also has been limited or barely playing in a number of games that he's been hurt in or during pregame. And if you remember the 2022, Anthony, he had a game with 1 snap and a game with 10 snaps where he was decoy. And so those were the worst because you started him. And one was a Sunday night game against the Ravens. People were counting on him and there was no news. So that's a problem. And then for Higgins, last year was a complete disaster. Not only did Higgins miss time, but we had Burrow with the calf injury early, so that offense was really neutered. He was getting the ball out so quick and throwing so short. And then we know Burrow was shut down for the second half of the campaign. Now, Anthony, Higgins played 12 games. 7 of those games, he had single-digit PPR points. And for a player who had a higher draft capital, that's really not acceptable. Although he had 3 games with at least 22 PPR points, and 2 of those came with Jake Browning. So we see the upside. Higgins can produce with elite players, but then he also has too many bad weeks. Let's even look at 2022, Anthony. He played 20 games. That includes the playoffs. He had a Super Bowl run that year. 6 of those games, single-digit PPR points. We said earlier, those 2 games that he had the pregame injuries were 2 of those 6. And again, 6 games over 15 points. So, Anthony, as we talk him through, injuries is a problem. The inconsistency is a problem because Jamar Chase is the number 1. And there are just games where Chase is going to get the targets and Higgins is going to take the back seat. We also know, though, Higgins is likely playing for a new contract. And if a player was ever motivated to be at his best, it would be that. How are you viewing Higgins this year?
You know, Higgins, if we scale back, you were going back into the history to 2021. That was his most productive year in fantasy. Wide receiver 12 in points per game, 14 games played. But if you look at the other 3 seasons, last season, wide receiver 40 in points per game, 2022, where he did play all 17, wide receiver 26 in points per game, and his rookie year in 2020, wide receiver 38. I think fantasy managers are chasing that 2021 year, almost similar to what they do with DK Metcalf, that one big year, and they're still chasing that. I think that's where we are with T. Higgins. You'll hear people say, especially after that 2021 year, that T. Higgins, he might be better than Jamar Chase. That's foolish. He's not anywhere close to Jamar Chase. No. I don't even think that it's a 1A, 1B situation. T. Higgins For me, he's a wide receiver 2 in the NFL. And I think his fantasy numbers are a lot closer to those other seasons than they are to that 2021 year where he was the wide receiver 12 in points per game. So going into this season, I think the ADP of T. Higgins is just about right. Last year, a little bit overvalued. I believe, if I remember correctly, late second, early third round pick. This year you're getting him significantly later. So the risk, the injury risk, the fact that Jamar Chase is the alpha, and the injury risk to Joe Burrow, that is all factored into T. Higgins' price point. So I'm fine taking him where he's going this year. But if his ADP, for whatever reason, began to trend up, I'm out.
So let's go a little further on this. Per Fantasy Mojo ADP last 5 days, we have T. Higgins as the wide receiver 29. In a vacuum, that sounds fine. But if you look at the 3 receivers going right before him, George Pickens, Amari Cooper, and Christian Kirk, all 3, even with Kirk playing the slot, are the number 1 options in their offense. Kirk is roughly a 1,200-yard player. He missed some time, but he was on that pace again last year. Cooper has averaged 1,200 yards into 2 years with Deshaun Watson and company in Cleveland. And George Pickens, despite horrible quarterback play, was in the 1150 range last year. T. Higgins has not hit any of those numbers in any of his years. So is there any world where Higgins would be a better draft pick than the wide receiver 26, 27, 28, which is Pickens, Cooper, and Kirk?
No, absolutely not. And even if you want to go a little bit further, you have guys like Chris Godwin going after T. Higgins. I might be more apt to draft Chris Godwin or maybe even a Terry McLaurin over T. Higgins.
Yeah, I was going to take that route next. So exactly, the players going directly after Higgins at 29. Tank Dell is wide receiver 30. You mentioned Godwin at 31, McLaurin at 32. And let's go 2 more. Hollywood Brown at 33 and Diontae Johnson at 34. So would you take Higgins over Dell? Tank Dell.
That's close.
Yes.
But I think I would say yes here because Dell might be the number 3 in his own offense. And I expect Cincinnati to throw a lot more than I expect Houston.
As you mentioned a moment ago, I am with you. Chris Godwin, we'll talk about him in a moment, so let's not get into any detail on Godwin. He's our next player. Godwin, I am definitely taking over Higgins, and it sounds like you are too, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
And then let's do 2 more. 3 more. Terry McLaurin. Now, I would take Higgins over McLaurin because McLaurin always has a solid floor, but though he basically puts up Higgins' numbers, but there's no ceiling beyond that. Would you take Higgins over McLaurin?
That is another close one for me. The only reason why I would take McLaurin this year is Cliff Kingsbury and Jaden Daniels, just in case this offense finally begins to hum. I think a big part of it is going to be Terry McLaurin. So if there's ever a chance we do see a ceiling season out of McLaurin, I think it's this year.
And the last 2, Hollywood Brown being there's some injury risk, but so does Higgins. So they have equal injury risk. And if you're going to tell me Hollywood Brown with his speed is playing with Patrick Mahomes, I'm putting him at Higgins. Love Higgins, but I'm putting Hollywood ahead of him. Diontae Johnson is close because I think PPR leagues, I think he's going to get a ton of targets. I think the floor is going to be good. But if I want a ceiling play, I think I might go Higgins over Diontae for ceiling. Again, Higgins versus Hollywood and Diontae.
I'm going to go with Hollywood Brown because Patrick Mahomes, there is no injury risk at the quarterback position in Kansas City. So I'm definitely going to side Hollywood Brown. When it comes to Diontae Johnson, I might be with you here on T. Higgins as well. You mentioned PPR leagues. We know Diontae is going to be the guy. I think recent training camp reports they're suggesting that he's going to be the featured guy in this offense, which is all well and good. He was also the featured wide receiver more times than not in Pittsburgh, and that offense wasn't great quarterback-wise. I don't know if we're going to get a great offense quarterback-wise out of Carolina. So what is the ceiling for Diontae Johnson?
Yes.
I think we would need to see Bryce Young take a positive step forward to get any type of a ceiling year out of Diontae. So I'll stick with T. Higgins here. Again, better offense, better quarterback.
Our next difficult to predict player for 2024 is Chris Godwin. We just mentioned him, of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, Godwin, look at the surface, 1,024 yards last year. It seems like that's a solid season for him. But the one thing I want to say that's good news, first time in 5 years, Godwin did not miss a game. We needed that. We needed a full health season. But here was the problem. The 1,024 on paper looks good. But Godwin last year was a floor play with very little upside. Through week 14, which is through everybody's fantasy regular season, he had 10 or fewer PPR points in 9 of those 14 games. That is not a very favorable number. Now, during the stretch, that stretch of through week 14, just 1 touchdown. So he was not more than a flex, and it was a shaky one at that. From week 15 through 18 and the 2 playoff games, though, Godwin did raise his scoring floor slightly. 4 of his last 5 games, up a little bit. He was at least 11.5 PPR points. That's more in the wide receiver 3 range. Now, when we look at this here, here's what I want to point out. The offense will change. Liam Cohen comes in. Liam Cohen has roots from the Sean McVay tree. He also coached in college at Kentucky. I'm more worried about the McVay part of this. One of the things that Liam Cohen said, Chris Godwin is getting back into the slot when they run 3 receiver sets. And to me, that's really important because last year, Chris Godwin was only 35% in the slot. He typically would play there 60+% of the time. And it was a problem because Baker Mayfield, he likes to throw downfield. The outside receiver across from Mike Evans, a downfield player, was never going to have a massive year at Mayfield. But we know Mayfield can use the slot. We go back to those years in Cleveland when Mayfield was healthy. He had 2 years at Jarvis Landry. Landry had just about 1,000 yards a season. That average is right there. And Chris Godwin is exponentially better. In Liam Cohen offense, we're probably going to see these receivers stacked in a little bit. And I think this is going to be a perfect storm for Godwin. So all that said, Anthony, where do you stand on Godwin?
I'm buying into a Chris Godwin bounce back year. We're already hearing reports they're going to be lining him up in the slot, really where he belongs. Last season, he was 26th in slot snaps. Usually he's a top player in that category. It seems like that's more of his natural position in the NFL. And if you look at Chris Godwin year by year, his numbers were always strong, especially in fantasy. Last year, he took a big downfall. A lot of that was because, in the past 3 seasons, 2001, 2022, he had at least 98 receptions. Last year, that dips down to 83. Essentially on similar number of targets. What was wrong with those targets probably had to do with a little bit of Baker Mayfield getting him the football. And also, touchdown-wise, Chris Godwin hasn't scored more than 3 touchdowns since 2021, so maybe we see positive touchdown regression here. A positive out of Chris Godwin, he did stay healthy, and there was a big jump where 2022, that final year with Brady, had 9.8 yards per reception. That went back to normal right around that 12.3 mark last season. So I think if Chris Godwin gets that same amount of targets and some more of them are catchable, maybe he builds that rapport with Baker Mayfield, I think we see a bounce back year out of Chris Godwin, who, again, he's been very good in fantasy since 2019. He's never finished worse than the wide receiver 15 in points per game until last season. So that was more of an outlier to me.
One last thing. Chris Godwin, 6'1", 208. When he's in the slot, he's a bigger slot receiver. He came into the league running a 4.4 240, which is outstanding, especially for a 208 player. And his shuttle time, which is one of the agility drills, he was 93rd percentile, and his 2 explosiveness drills were above the 70th percentile. For his size, Chris Godwin is the real deal. And again, when he is optimized in the slot, he is a lethal football player, and I think that move back there this year, and he'll play obviously the outside in 2 receiver sets, which is fine. But I'm with you. I think Chris Godwin at wide receiver 31, he is being drastically undervalued. And Anthony, I expect that Tampa Bay defense to struggle. They've had, Vita Vea's hurt every year, another year older. Yeah. Carlton Davis didn't play well last year. He's gone. They've had some linebacker turnover. This defense overall is not very good. They have some players, but overall, we know obviously Winfield, the safety, is an elite player, but I think they're going to give up a lot of points, even though their schedule is soft, and they're going to have to throw, and that's to the benefit of Chris Godwin. And the interior offensive line does not block well. Yeah. The tackles did well, but the interior offensive line problems and the slot receiver, those kind of align together well. So again, we said the same thing with when we talk about T. Higgins. So we already said we would draft Godwin over Higgins. To me, Godwin over Tank Dell. Godwin's wide receiver 31, Tank Dell's 30. To me, it's Godwin easy. What about you?
I think for me, team build's going to play a role here where Godwin is that higher floor player. If I need some ceiling, depending on my roster build, let's say if I have a lot of stability, a lot of high floor receivers already, then I wouldn't mind taking a shot on Tank Dell because he is going to bring those big pop ceiling games. And we also know, Nico Collins does miss some time, which is going to benefit Tank Dell at some point. So it's roster build dependent with these two. If I need, I like Godwin more times than not, but if I need a little bit more ceiling in my roster, or if I'm in a tournament where points matter in the playoffs, then I'm going to go Dell.
And then Godwin is wide receiver 31. Terry McLaurin is wide receiver 32. Again, fantasymojo.com ADP last 5 days. Look, I think Godwin has the floor that matches McLaurin's ceiling. They're both about 1,000 yards. Yeah. I think Godwin could get more. For me, it's Godwin easy. What about you?
Same thing. I'm in on Godwin here.
Now, I will take Hollywood Brown over Godwin. I am buying into the Chiefs offense. I buy into Patrick Mahomes. I think that offense will score a lot of points. How do you feel on that one?
Same. Anytime you ask me about a Chiefs player, really outside of Xavier Worthy, I'm going to side with the Kansas City Chiefs player. I'm heavily buying in. I bought into this Chiefs offense all offseason, and I'm not going to steer away from that. Hollywood Brown, we've seen him flash in the past. He's played with good quarterbacks. I'm going to preface it like Lamar Jackson, very good quarterback. Kyler, very good quarterback. Patrick Mahomes is the best and by far the best thrower of the football that Hollywood Brown has ever and probably will ever play with.
Those who've listened to me all offseason, you've heard me say this about Marquise Brown. Marquise Brown is one of the best receivers in the league. When a play breaks down, his ability and understanding of when to get vertical. And nobody buys time while looking downfield better than Patrick Mahomes. To me, the skill set of Brown and what Mahomes does best, to me, this is a perfect marriage. And so not only will Brown get high efficiency targets, but there are going to be probably 6 to 10 plays where they just break it downfield, and it's going to be fun to watch. Hey, the biggest pro football contests in Vegas are back. Circa Survivor and Circa Million are now up to $16 million in guaranteed prizes. 2 ways to win and no rake. Circa Survivor contestants select one team each week with no point spread. Last the longest to win it all with $10 million guaranteed. In Circa Million, make 5 picks against the spread each week for your share of $6 million guaranteed. Quarterly and full season payouts. Enter in Nevada, play from anywhere. Visit circasports.com for details. Also, we're less than 3 weeks away from the Fantasy Football Expo in Canton, Ohio, and RotoWire is giving away 5 free tickets this week. Meet your favorite fantasy football and DFS experts at panel discussions, breakout sessions, and over 50 exhibitors. For your chance to win a free one-day pass, simply subscribe to the RotoWire Fantasy Football YouTube channel and send an email to social@rotowire.com. Again, email to social@rotowire.com and subscribe to the RotoWire Fantasy Football YouTube channel. We have a full sports one. The football one's important here. In the email to social@rotowire.com, in the subject, put Expo tickets, and that needs to be done as soon as you're listening to this because this deadline is going to pass almost immediately. 5 lucky fans will be randomly selected. I hope to see you in Canton. All right, Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers is our next player, Anthony. And Christian Watson has missed 11 games over his first 2 seasons. That's going to scare a lot of fantasy managers away. Primarily, it's been hamstring issues. Now, Watson did see a specialist in the offseason. The NFL has put a lot of money into the research of recurring hamstring injuries. Apparently, the news that Watson got was his 2 hamstrings. I'm going to just say this in layman's terms. His 2 hamstrings were not firing equally. So the work he did with the doctors were to work on getting his hamstrings closer to being equal. And Watson says they are much, much closer than they were, and he's still continuing to try to get those as close together as possible. If that's solved, he could be beyond those hamstring issues. We don't know for sure, but they're taking the right steps. Now, before Watson suffered that second injury in 2023, I want you to know that he was targeted 7 to 9 times in 5 out of 8 games. Now, the yardage wasn't great. Here's the thing I want to say. The Green Bay offense, Anthony, was struggling greatly. The first couple of weeks of the season, they had a couple of games they were trailing, and the fantasy numbers were good. Through week 9, the offense was largely dysfunctional. There were people who dropped Jordan Love from fantasy rosters.
Yeah.
Week 12 on, Matt LaFleur figured it out. He realized what his young receivers could do. He realized what his young quarterback could do. And all of a sudden, it was schemed up like an orchestra. That helped Christian Watson. Watson had 2 games before he went down in week 14. In those last 2 games, when the offense was humming, 5 for 94 and a touchdown on 7 targets against the Lions. Bad defense, I get it. But then he went 7 for 71 and 2 touchdowns against the Chiefs, who are an excellent defense. So in those games, he averaged 90 yards and 1.5 touchdowns. That said, I mentioned earlier, Green Bay's offense turned the corner. We expect that to continue. Watson tried to address his hammy issues. I want to point one more thing, Anthony. We go back to that rookie season for Watson. We understand he had that incredible 3-week run in 2022 when he caught 12 passes for 265 yards and 6 touchdowns. I also want to point out, after that stretch, the league did catch up to him that year because he averaged 50 yards per game to end that season. So he was still good, but the league started putting a shell over it because he was a big play threat. All that said, I think Christian Watson can emerge as an alpha type because Jaden Reed plays a slot. They don't like him on the outside a lot. When they're in 2 receiver sets, which they like, because the Packers run a lot of 2 tight end sets, means 2 receivers on the field. Watson has a chance of being nearly a full-time player. And I think at ADP, and he's wide receiver 39. Talk about, and we'll do the comps on players later. Talk about Christian Watson this year.
You know, Christian Watson is a player, and really, since you've been bringing up he's trying to get his lower body and his hamstrings right, I'm starting to buy in. And when you dig into Christian Watson, he flashes special when he's healthy and on the football field. Scaling back to his rookie season, he was a top 10 fantasy receiver in the second half of 2022. He's I don't want to call him he's not a high risk. Like where we're getting him, he's a low risk, high reward option. Like if he can stay healthy and build off of the player he was down the stretch in 2022, there's realistic top 15, top 12 fantasy wide receiver potential here. It's just a matter of the big if is staying healthy. Now, there are some other red flags. There is a lot of competition in targets on this Green Bay offense. We look at Jaden Reed, even a guy like Wicks, Bo Melton. They have 2 very good pass-catching tight ends. They brought in Marshawn Lloyd, a very good pass-catching running back. And I also expect this offense to run more. If this defense improves, they're going to run more and not throw as much as they did last year, because logically, if you didn't throw that much with Aaron Rodgers, why are you going to throw that much with Jordan Love, who has some efficiency deficiencies anyway? So I like the price point for Christian Watson, because again, that big time ceiling is very much there. It's just a matter of, can he stay healthy?
All right, so we will rank these players that are close to ADP with maybe a 1-sentence comp. So we say Watson's wide receiver 39. Wide receiver 35 is Keenan Allen. Who do you prefer? Give me 1 sentence as to why.
Christian Watson, it's not close. Watson's a lot closer to the number 1 option on his team with a more proven quarterback, where Keenan Allen, not only he has zone injury concerns, but he could very well be the number 3 option if Rome Odunze takes a big leap in his rookie year.
Yeah, age 32 and the injury concerns with Allen. Give me the younger guy with the injury concerns there. I agree with you there. Rashee Rice, wide receiver 36, and Christian Watson, wide receiver 39. Who do you like?
Rashee Rice. And with the potential suspension for Rashee Rice, and at this point, I don't believe it's going to happen, and the potential injury risk, I think it's a wash with those 2 players. And again, another Kansas City Chiefs wide receiver, Rashee Rice, going into this offseason, late 2nd, early 3rd round pick in fantasy drafts. I'm all in on this Chiefs offense and Rice.
This show is not going to be about Rashee Rice, but I want to spend 1 minute on him. Rashee Rice was interesting last year. They had nobody to throw the football to. Travis Kelce was fighting through injury. He was getting ganged up on the defenses. They had nobody else. Rashee Rice emerged as a reliable option. And I like this profile coming in. We have Marquise Brown now. I don't think Xavier Worthy's a threat. I think he's more of a clear-out option, which is fine. Kelce, because of the speed on the field, though, is going to have a lot more room to operate. I think the targets Rashee Rice saw in the second half of last season were out of desperation. Good player, but I believe they had nobody else to throw the ball to. I have a hard time thinking he's going to command more targets than Marquise Brown.
Wow.
Because Marquise Brown to me he's an alpha. He's small, but he's an alpha. Rashee Rice was pushed in that role by necessity. Quick thought.
That's interesting. I don't think I've heard that take from you before.
No.
Wow. It makes sense. And yes, I can see a world where Marquise Brown is viewed as an alpha because some people view Devonta Smith, very similar profiles, as an alpha. So, I mean, I'm still going to buy into Rice. And a lot of it is there are a little bit less injury concerns with Rice, where there are some concerns with Hollywood Brown.
Last one I'm going to ask you.
I think that's my breaking point.
Last one I'll ask you. We'll move on. Christian Watson, wide receiver 39, or Ladd McConkey, wide receiver 40. I know you love McConkey.
I love Ladd McConkey. And this is a situation where we don't know what McConkey is. We know what he profiles as. We know his draft capital. We know who his quarterback is. And we know that this defense is going to be a work in progress. And despite who the coaches are, they're going to have to throw a lot more than people think they will. And his biggest competition for targets is probably Josh Palmer. And I know Quentin Johnson's getting a little bit of hype right now, but it's training camp. They're not even in pads. I'm not really bothering with that. I'm going to lean Ladd McConkey. I just feel like he's the safer player.
I lied. I said that was the last one. I think it's important to note that Jaden Reed's the wide receiver 38, same team Watson's the wide receiver 39. What I'm going to tell fantasy managers is this. If you don't buy that Watson can stay healthy, then I think you go Jaden Reed all day long, because even though he plays mostly slot, and I know Dontavian Wicks would move into a bigger role, I think Reed would be pressed into a heavier role if Watson were to miss time. So if you believe that, I'd go that route. Otherwise, like I said, I'm very concerned that Reed sees a snap squeeze because the team showed they like him in the slot and they play a lot of two tight end sets. Any quick word on Jaden Reed versus Christian Watson? They're right next to each other.
You know, earlier this offseason, it was all Jaden Reed, but again, I'm buying into Christian Watson. There's Reed's a nice player. He's versatile. They like to give him handoffs. They could do a lot of different things with him, but I don't see special with Jaden Reed where I see some special in Christian Watson.
No doubt. All right, the next player we'll talk about that's tough to predict, Diontae Johnson. We mentioned him earlier, of the Carolina Panthers. Now, Diontae Johnson is fully expected to be the number one receiver in this offense, and I know people are talking up Xavier Legette. I see Xavier Legette as a boundary receiver that goes vertical, and if Bryce Young is going to struggle in one area, I really believe is verticality. So I don't think Bryce Young's skill set fits with Legette at all. What we saw last year, though, if you could get open quickly underneath, Bryce Young loves you. And we saw it with Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen had a great stretch, maybe through week 7, where he put up monster numbers. But again, that's a player who can't separate like he used to. Diontae Johnson is one of the best receivers in the league at separating quickly, like nanosecond at the line. Gives that quarterback a very quick, reliable target. He'll drop some passes, but I don't think drops are a real big problem for Diontae Johnson. The team traded for him, so it's important that they brought him in. I think he is exactly what Bryce Young needs. The offensive line did get bolstered in the interior in Carolina. That also may help Young, work with Johnson a little better. I just don't see a downfield game going. I want you also to know Diontae Johnson between 2020 and 2022. Here are his averages: 94 catches, 989 yards, and 5 touchdowns. In those seasons, he had an end-of-the-career noodle arm Ben Roethlisberger, where the defenses moved everything up because they knew he couldn't throw downfield, and Kenny Pickett, who now is a backup with the Eagles. All right, all that said, I'm not a big Bryce Young supporter, but Bryce Young is a bit of an upgrade on Pickett and the end-of-career Roethlisberger. Not low bar, Anthony's a low bar here. What are your thoughts on Diontae Johnson this year?
Number one, Diontae coming over to Carolina, he's going to go back probably to his usual X receiver role. Very similar to those Steelers teams before George Pickens, minimal competition for targets, and the quarterback's probably going to look to his first read more times than not. But the issue with Diontae Johnson, this is why he's more of a high floor option. He lacks elite upside in his profile. If we look at Diontae Johnson, he had, this is another guy, one big year, 2021, wide receiver, 8 points per game. Since that season, 2 back-to-back wide receiver 39 finishes and points per game. Now, last year in Pittsburgh, his targets were almost cut in half. But one thing to note, if you look at his career, by far a career high last season in yards per reception. So it was like he had a little bit more, giddy up in his step, because normally he's a 10, 11 yard per reception player. So again, this is a very familiar situation for Diontae Johnson. He's more than likely, barring injury, going to lead the team in targets, but I need to find a reason to tell myself, hey, there's some ceiling here, and I just don't see it. Again, his best season, 107 receptions, almost 1,200 yards and 8 touchdowns. Is there a world where he gets that in Carolina? I'm sure there is. But again, it's just a matter of, can Bryce Young take a step forward, and can he stay upright enough to get the ball to Diontae?
Look, I think Johnson has a nice floor. Like you said, I don't know where the ceiling is. The 3 players right before Diontae Johnson, who's wide receiver 34 in drafts, are Chris Godwin, Terry McLaurin, Hollywood Brown. You've heard us mention these players. They're all in the same range. Hence, they're the ones that are tough to predict. All day Godwin, all day Hollywood Brown. Terry McLaurin and Diontae Johnson, to me, is interesting because I think week to week, Diontae Johnson has a much more stable floor. I think overall, McLaurin has more spike weeks. I think it's clear that you're going Godwin and Hollywood. So what are your thoughts between McLaurin and Diontae Johnson?
Yeah, I think of these exercises, I picked McLaurin the first time with the first player we talked about. This is another situation where it's going to come down to team build. They're both going to have similar floors. I like what you're saying about the spike weeks with Terry McLaurin, because I do believe in Jaden Daniels much more than I believed in Bryce Young going into his rookie year. I think if you want to play it safe, Diontae Johnson's the way to go. This is not a guy who's going to lose you a week. He's going to get you those 10 PPR points, and if he gets you more, great. But there isn't going to be a lot of games where he gets you less than that. Where Terry McLaurin, he does have, like it's now or never. He's getting up there in age. If it doesn't happen this year in terms of one big year, when I say big, I'm not saying top 12. When I say big, maybe he sneaks into the top 20. So I think I slightly lean Terry McLaurin here, but I don't like it.
Diontae Johnson, one more thing, the defense in Carolina. Brian Burns is gone. Not that Dante Jackson was a very good corner, but he's a starting corner for them. He's gone, and that's going to be difficult for them to replace. And I know they got J.C. Horner, he's healthy on the other side, but there's a problem there. I think Carolina's defense moves back a bit from last year. They also lost some linebacker help. So I think overall it was not a great offseason for Carolina's defense. And I think they're going to have to throw a little more than they want to. So I think we both ascertain that Johnson is a good floor play. So consider that when you're drafting. All right, we are going to take a short break, and we're going to talk more difficult to project players. All right. What's with fantasy football scores looking like an NBA All-Star game? Let's get real with Acme Real Fantasy Football. The top pro teams average around 28 points a game. This is how Acme Real Fantasy Football scoring system is based. The system is also very accurate compared to the actual game score. Each team drafts only 9 players, filling the primary positions. Benches are only used for injured and bye-week players. This leaves 200 free agents available to improve your team. Weekly waivers gives preference to the bottom of the standings. League rankings are always changing, keeping it competitive the entire season. Acme Real Fantasy Football also has a one-of-a-kind playoff format, selecting a new lineup each week. All teams are competing from week 1 through the Super Bowl. 12-team leagues start at only $120. Go to acmerealfantasyfootball.com and sign up today. Anthony Cervino, our next difficult-to-project player, is Dallas Goedert of the Philadelphia Eagles. Dallas Goedert is a supremely talented player. Injuries definitely work against him. 10 missed games over the last 3 seasons. It's significant. You know, we need our players on the field, and some tight ends are a lot more durable than Goddard's been. Also, the other issue that we especially saw last year, and the coaching was bad last year, so I'll qualify, but you got A.J. Brown, you got Devontae Smith, and they are both receivers that command targets. So sometimes we see games where there are low target totals for Dallas Goedert. Last year in 5 of 14 games, he was targeted 4 or fewer times. That's not cutting it for a tight end you're drafting in the top 8-ish last year. This year, it's a little later than that. Now, there were games where he was targeted between 7 and 9 times. It happened 7 times. So that's a good level of targets, but it was inconsistent is what my point is. Now, the production for Goedert fell off drastically last year. 592 yards and 3 touchdowns in 14 games. And his yards per reception was only 10. He previously had 12.8 and 14.8, so that went way down. I am willing, though, to give it a bit of a pass because whether it was Nick Sirianni calling the offense or Brian Johnson, the offensive coordinator, I mentioned when I talk A.J. Brown, after week 8, defenses figured out they were just looking to throw downfield. They put more of a shell there. There were no answers. And then Goddard gets hurt as well. So Goddard is aging now. He's starting to hit his decline phase. So that's another thing we need to begin to consider. All that said, I'm excited that Kellen Moore comes in to run the offense. I mention this frequently. Kellen Moore looks to do a downfield passing attack to set up underneath stuff. And if that works, Dallas Goedert could be very much weaponized. Anthony, I'm going to go over to Kellen Moore history with tight ends. In 2019, with a 37-year-old Jason Witten, who barely could run anymore, 83 targets, 529 yards and 4 touchdowns. 2020, Dalton Schultz breaking into the league, 89 targets, 615 yards. 2021, Dalton Schultz again, 104 targets, 808 yards. I'm almost done. 2022, last year with Dalton Schultz, another 89 targets and 577 yards. And then finally last year, Gerald Everett, who is not a full-time type player, still saw 70 targets. And for Gerald Everett, a 411-yard season was very good. 83 to 104 targets in 4 of 5 years for tight ends that play with Kellen Moore. And Dallas Goedert is significantly better of a football player than Dalton Schultz, and certainly better than a 37-year-old Jason Witten. So there is reason for optimism. Thoughts on Dallas Goedert?
No, Dallas Goedert, and you did a good job bringing up something I was going to bring up, which is Kellen Moore historically liking to utilize the tight end. If we look at Goedert, you bring up the lack of targets. He was never a highly targeted player, even in years where he finished as, a tight end 5 in points per game back in 2022, albeit he only played in 12 games, 68 targets, 83 targets last year, 87 targets. 2019 was a career high, but every year since 2019, he's finished as a top 12 tight end in points per game. The good thing this year is he's being drafted at the right spot. Right now, FFPC tight end 12. So he's being drafted where I believe his floor is. And if Dallas Goedert can stay healthy in this offense, then I think there's some room for him to outperform his ADP. Now, last year, I think he was being drafted a little bit higher. So it was a little bit more of a bust. But anytime you get a player who historically, I get the age decline, I get there's a lot of weapons, but I think there's some boxes to check off with Kellen Moore, and the fact that Dallas Goedert is still an excellent weapon, especially in the red zone. Like, I don't mind taking my shots on Dallas Goedert. The biggest risk is injury. This offense, you bring up defenses that are a work in progress, and teams are going to have to throw a lot. Philly's going to have to throw a lot. And they have a lot of talent. It's young talent. I think it could gel. It could be one of those defenses that breaks out in December just in time for the playoffs. But when it comes to fantasy football, they're probably going to be bad for a good chunk of our fantasy season, which is good for Eagles pass catchers.
And so, Anthony, Dallas Goedert, as you said, Fantasy Mojo ADP last 5 days, tight end 12. The tight end 10 is David Njoku. The tight end 11 is Brock Bowers. David Njoku did not do well with quarterbacks not named Joe Flacco last year. It was very ordinary. Brock Bowers is in a situation with bad quarterback play. Devontae Adams is still with the team. Don't know what the future is going to bring, but he's a big target dog on a team that wants to play defense and run the ball. I like Dallas Goedert better than both. Do you have a difference of opinion?
Who was the second one again?
Bowers and Njoku.
Yeah, I'm completely out on Brock Bowers. And if anybody has listened to our shows or watched our videos, and you can go watch the archive of videos on the YouTube channel. And if you do, make sure you subscribe. But like the situation for Bowers with the Raiders, with that quarterback play, and the one I bring up the most is, let's say it's Aiden O'Connell. Devontae Adams, as many targets as he had last year, he averaged fewer than 10 PPR points a game in games that Aiden O'Connell started. I don't know if Gardner Minshew's that much of an upgrade. And if Devontae can't get, like, the only hope for Bowers is if Devontae Adams is traded. And then when it comes to Njoku, I think this offense is going to try to push the ball downfield more as long as Deshaun Watson's healthy. And I think they told us that by bringing in a big play threat like Jerry Jeudy.
Now, one more I'll say. Goddard is the tight end 12. Freiermuth is the tight end 13. Look, we talked about him on other shows. And like Anthony said, our football-only RotoWire YouTube channel, we got over 100 videos. Anything that you want to hear about, go subscribe and check it out, because we have a ton of great stuff up there. We think you'll love it. Anyway, Freiermuth goes into an offense with Arthur Smith. Jonnu Smith had 582 yards in that offense last year. You know what? Actually, we're going to talk about Freiermuth next. So I'm going to can this discussion and let's circle back. But I want to point out this first. Is there something you wish your fantasy league had, or features that are missing from your current leagues? Bonus scoring, custom schedules or playoffs, deeper team settings? Well, look no further, because we have you covered with our friends at Fantrax. Fantrax is the most customizable fantasy platform in the industry, offering the greatest fantasy experience for your dynasty, keeper, redraft, and best ball leagues. Fantrax even offers college football fantasy leagues. Create or join a fantasy football commissioner league, invite your friends, and dominate your draft this season. Fantrax is the top dynasty football platform in the industry. Coming in from another service? Not a problem. Fantrax can easily import any of your current league settings and rosters. Ever have a trade go wrong or make a mistake in dropping a player? Fantrax commissioner tools allow you to undo any move with one simple click. Fantrax is running a special promotion you don't want to miss. Sign up for free at fantrax.com/RotoWire today to enter for your chance to win tickets to any regular season NFL game for you and your entire league, plus $6,000 in spending cash. That's right, tickets for your entire league. Simply create a new league or bring over your existing leagues for more chances to win. Again, go to fantrax.com/RotoWire and sign up today. Fantrax, the home of fantasy sports. All right, Anthony, our last player for today, Pat Freiermuth. I started to bring him up. We'll compare him to Goddard when we're done. No need to jump the timing on that. So, Freiermuth. 2022 is a very good season for Pat Freiermuth. 732 yards for a tight end. Remember, there are only 5 tight ends in the last 5 years that had 1,000 yards. So 732, solid number. But last year, 2023, Freiermuth was a massive disappointment. In that 2022 season, 6 targets per game. Last year, 4 per game. That's nothing. 4 targets is useless. And also the depth of target. In 2022, Freiermuth was seeing 7.5 yards per target. Last year, almost a full yard less, 6.6. Now, Arthur Smith comes in, and I was starting to point this out when I was talking about Dallas Goedert. Kyle Pitts has been a player that people are knocking Freiermuth because of. He's saying, well, Arthur Smith screwed up Kyle Pitts, so we don't like Freiermuth. Kyle Pitts was used as a deep threat in that offense. 99th percentile average depth of target from 2 bad quarterbacks. Going back 2 years, it was 3 bad quarterbacks. That was never going to work. But I want to point a couple things out. Jonnu Smith, 582 yards and 70 targets. That is a baseline low floor for Freiermuth. Darnell Washington is the second tight end. Michael Pruitt they brought over. They have other tight ends on the roster, but basically Darnell Washington's a blocker. That's all he's going to do. Freiermuth will be freed up to catch the football. Now, other than George Pickens, they draft Roman Wilson. He's a slot. This team could play up to 80% heavy personnel. If Smith does what he did in Atlanta, there is no slot receiver in that offense. And we have Calvin Austin, tiny dude, unlikely to be a factor. Freiermuth screams number 2 option on this team. Anthony, I'm going to give you the history of Arthur Smith, the tight ends, before I turn to you. 2019, Arthur Smith was the offensive coordinator in Tennessee. He had Delaney Walker, who got hurt, and then Jonnu Smith took over. So it was a combo. 75 targets, 654 yards, and 5 touchdowns. In 2020, still Arthur Smith, the coordinator in Tennessee. Jonnu Smith, again, not a good receiving tight end. 65 targets, 448 yards, and 8 touchdowns. Then he goes, Arthur Smith, to Atlanta. 2021. Pitts gets 110 targets and 1,026 yards. Hayden Hurst at an additional 31 targets, so 141 tight end targets. 2022, Pitts gets hurt. Michael Pruitt is the number 2. Still 80 targets, 506 yards, and 6 touchdowns. Last one I'll tell you. Last year, between Kyle Pitts and Jonnu Smith, 160 targets, over 1,200 yards, and 6 touchdowns from the 2 tight ends. Freiermuth is going to get that big of production, but he is the only legitimate receiving tight end that I see on this roster. And there is a very strong world where he sees 90-plus targets, and I think he could crush ADP. Thoughts?
Freiermuth is somebody I was initially out on, but I find myself buying in. There was some rumblings, about a month or so ago that the Steelers could potentially bring in a legitimate wide receiver too. That has not happened. And since that has not happened, right now we're in training camp, then yes, the path for Pat Freiermuth to be the number 2 team leader in targets behind George Pickens, I think that's a realistic possibility. Now, you brought up the target shares, but I'm going to give you just last year, Falcons tight ends under Arthur Smith, a 31.7 overall target share and 29.3% red zone target share. That's big news for Pat Freiermuth, because like you said, like Darnell Washington, maybe you see some gadget plays in the red zone, but Pat Freiermuth should own the red zone with Russell Wilson or possibly even Justin Fields, but I think it's going to be Wilson barring injury. So but the tides have turned for me in Pat Freiermuth. I like chasing tight ends who have a path to be the number 1 or number 2 team leader in targets, and Freiermuth is now added to my list.
So Pat Freiermuth, he goes right after Dallas Goedert, and then there's David Njoku at tight end 10 and Bowers at 11. Freiermuth I have right after Jake Ferguson, and basically they're close. To me, they're almost tied. I prefer Ferguson, but I could make a case for in a league where you're getting bonus points for tight ends, I like to roster both, a higher tight end and then Freiermuth. But Freiermuth, my leagues where I'm using 2 tight ends because of tight end premium scoring, I am getting Freiermuth wherever I can. Thoughts on where to draft him or how much you're going to invest?
Now that we're going into draft season, I do a lot of FFPC leagues, which is tight end premium anyway. I think I'm going to get a significant amount of Pat Freiermuth. I love the price point there. I think he's going as a tight end 11 off the board in those types of leagues. I absolutely, I'm out on Brock Bowers. So, if Freiermuth falls to right around his cost, which is 89.1, the current ADP in Fantasy Pros contest. I'll take him over. I think I'll take him over Goddard. TJ Hawkinson's floating around there, but he was just, I think he's on the PUP list or at least on the NFI list. Like, we have no idea when he's coming back. I get in these FFPC tournaments in best ball, it's worth making an investment, but at least I know Pat Freiermuth is going to be there. Really, who knows what TJ Hawkinson is going to be coming off the injury to a team where we don't know what this quarterback pulse is going to be right now. Like, it's going to be Darnold. Are we going to get any type of good Darnold? If it is McCarthy, is there going to be growing pains? So there's just a lot of question marks with that situation. And he's going, again, 2 spots after Freiermuth.
I will make my last case to pile on with you here. And my recommendation is do not draft TJ Hawkinson. I know you want to be smarter than the field. I know you want to have the superstar at the end of the season when you know you're first place in your tournament and he puts you over the top. I'm going to explain this to you. The surgery for the ACL was January 26th. The fastest recovery time is 9 months. That puts him in week 9, and that's if it's a perfect recovery. And even Breece Hall took 4 games of light snaps coming back to be back acclimated to the lineup. If you think Freiermuth was hitting the ground running is one thing, here's the other problem. No practice reps with either quarterback. The whole preseason, Hawkinson will not work with J.J. McCarthy. He will not work with Sam Darnold. And understand this, when they're playing those 9 games or more without Hawkinson, don't think for a minute those quarterbacks will not grow dependent on Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison. And then you bring in Hawkinson. It's not going to be all of a sudden, let's forget our receivers we got good with. Let's just figure out what this other guy is. That's not happening. I think it's 100-1 shot that Hawkinson is anything useful for you this fantasy season. Give me half a minute on that. How crazy am I on that?
I don't think you're crazy at all. And I like that how you put it, where, you want to be smarter than the field. That's burned me way too many times where, and again, I play a lot. I play volume teams, and I still want to try to be smarter than everybody and draft these guys coming off injury. And I don't know if there's many times where it worked out. So I'm going to be smarter than myself and just stay away from TJ Hawkinson. And even Nick Chubb, that one's scary a little bit too, but that's another conversation.
Another conversation. Hey, RotoWire covers all the fantasy sports. Did you know you can get a free 2-day trial, no credit card needed, to check out everything we have to offer? You just get that trial by going to rotowire.com/pod. If you like what we have, join the team. If not, we're glad you took a look, and we move our separate ways. We want to thank our sponsor, Circa Sports, where you can compete for $16 million in total prizes by playing in the Circa Million 6 and the Survivor contest. And thanks to everyone for listening. Come back next week for another edition of the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast.